people connect with radio. I believe it's a very interesting study investigating how you've been able to connect radio's effectiveness with digital activity.
That's right, sir. It's a piece of work we conducted for Commercial Radio Australia earlier in this year. Okay, so look, what we'll do is take you through the background to this, the kind of core issues, the solutions that we devised, what we found, 5 key takeouts, and why the approach works. Look, this was a pretty innovative piece of work, and I think it's fair to say that what we've conducted here is the first study, I think, in Australia to establish the direct link between exposure of listeners or viewers or whatever to particular media and the online response that triggers amongst consumers. So, by way of background, the kind of questions we were trying to address here for Commercial Radio Australia, they came to us saying that our brand campaign that we're looking to develop in 2012 is about proving the link between exposure to radio advertising and the online response that prompts. And they kind of say, can you investigate that and hopefully prove it? So kind of issues we're looking at are about cross-platform media consumption. It's about the way in which exposure to advertising in radio affects people's behavior online in relation to the brands that are advertising. Kind of exploring a little bit more about the intimacy, the engagement factor that radio it has with its audience, and how advertisers can leverage that. So, in a nutshell, we're trying to address, how effective is radio advertising at provoking or inspiring that response. So the way we did this, it's a kind of three-pronged approach, a bit of a blend of the old and the new. So the first thing we did, we recruited a panel from our wider online panel. We were looking for people who regularly consumed radio for 2 stations in Sydney and Melbourne. So we asked people to participate in a media consumption diary over a couple of weeks. Secondly, we needed the media schedules for all of the adverts that were on air over that 2-week period on those 2 radio stations. And in particular, what we're looking for here are radio adverts that have a digital call to action. In other words, the advert asks people to visit the brand's website, become introduced on Facebook, but the core part of the creative includes the digital call to action. So that's all good, but it's not going to tell you anything about what people do online. Do they respond to that? So the challenge there was, we can't. There's no way that you can go back and ask people to recall what they did online. We felt that the best way to do this was to have a device, a cookie, which we could install on our panelists' laptops. So we use a piece of software called NetPanel. Essentially, kind of NetPanel. The panelist is told that we send the panelist the cookie and ask them to install that. The device, the cookie then sits quietly in the background over the 2-week period and streams data back to my research team, and it is telling us everything about the websites that people come from, where they go to, their destinations, when they're on a website, the particular pages that they click on, and so on and so forth. Sounds pretty Big Brother-ish. I think what we found was that kind of once people were accustomed to the idea, they just got on and browsed the web in pretty much the way in which they do normally. One of the kind of the indications that they kind of told us that behaviour was kind of normal is that a significant proportion of the males on our panel were going to probably the more exotic parts of the internet, and that's when we present that, and kind of the audience goes, really, yeah, absolutely. It's quite clear that people weren't necessarily modifying their behaviour. So that's pretty much kind of how we did it. The analysis of those 3 bits of data was not easy. So I'll just let Adrian now say a little bit more about kind of how we brought those 3 data sources together to produce our results.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Essentially, there were 3 data sources, as Steve mentioned. So we had the listener diary with all the listening behaviour over a 2-week period and which station they were listening to. And then we had the browser data, which had all the logs of online activity, what websites they visited, search engines they used, and so on, and the time which they did that. And then we had the media schedules, so which ads were on which station and what times they were on air. So then we needed to put this together into a database that we could actually analyse. So the first step was to use the diary data to actually categorise people into exposed versus not exposed groups for each day. So these are whether or not these people were listening to the relevant radio station and had the opportunity to hear the ad. The next step was to code the net logs from the browser data from NetPanel. And we did this using a whole lot of text searches by brand to identify relevant online activity. So we did the searches and coded them essentially based on visits to an advertiser's website, visits to a branded social media or Facebook page, and searches for a category by brand in a search engine. So that was either by category or by brand. Then we needed to merge the data together, both the diary data and the coded net logs together. And once we had accomplished that, we used the merged database to run a series of essentially just crosstabs and filters to work out how many people in the exposed group did something in response to an advertising that they may have heard versus those people in the not exposed group. What sort of digital activity did they do? Things like branded searches, visits to websites, and so on. And then run our analysis based on people, but then also looking at averages for all the advertising as well.
Great, thanks, Adrian. So no mean feat. Quite a few challenges in terms of data management. So, okay, just to summarise the recruitment, I'll just go back a page. Sorry. Okay, so we invited 700. We recruited 750 panel members, and we had an overall completion rate of 469, which is about 65%. So that's a pretty decent effort. Commercial Radio Australia have been trialling online diaries in relation to a possible substitute for paper diaries, and the completion rate there has been about 60%. So, given the fact that we also asked people to install a cookie, that's not a bad result, and it's fairly kind of evenly split across Sydney and Melbourne. Just in terms of terminology, when we're talking about adverts with a digital call to action, those are executions that contain that online message. When we go through the results, we'll talk about exposed listeners. So those are people who are exposed, who are tuned into the radio and were on air listening to the radio when those adverts were broadcast. And finally, when we talk about digital activity, we're talking about activity that's in relation to the advertiser's brand website or social media pages. If, for example, it's a bank and somebody's doing online banking, we would exclude that we would not count that as digital activity. So we had 469 panel members, 72 adverts with a digital call to action, and we covered 2 weeks of tracking. Just in terms of that kind of group of people who are exposed, so we found that across all of those 72 adverts that were on air over that 2-week period, 65% of our panel was exposed to at least one advert. So in a sense, our control group here is the 35% of people who were not exposed to one of those adverts on the radio. If the campaign was multi-channel, for example, on television, outdoor, and so on, our hypothesis is that the weight of that campaign would probably have meant that a non-exposed group had a much higher probability of being exposed to the advert on television, for example. But this study focused purely on radio, so we're contrasting those exposed versus those who are not exposed. So what do we find? Probably the first and most compelling statistic is that people are 6 times more likely to look for an advertiser's brand online if they advertise the brand on the radio and the website. That's an astonishing multiplier effect. That has led CRA's 2012 brand campaign. So if you've heard any of the adverts, about 6 times more likely that's driven by that one number. It also has an immediate effect, and again that's been built into the creative for CRA's campaign. The over 3/4 of activities taking place within 24 hours. It's also kind of quite interesting that we found that a significant proportion are also engaging with the radio station's website or their social media pages. So we kind of identified that very much as an opportunity to integrate online and on-air advertising. So let's just kind of go through in a bit more detail about the how we created, looking at the effects of radio advertising. The first thing, if we just look at the audience activity as a whole, in relation to those who are not exposed, around half of that group are doing some form of digital activity in relation to one of those brands advertising. So across all of the 72 ads. So that kind of seems to be what people are doing anyway. But once they're exposed, that level of activity rises, is a 28% uplift and rises to 64%. How that might look for a theoretical radio station with a million regular listeners, you'd have 350,000 who would not be exposed to any of that advertising, and 650,000 would be exposed. The first resulting in 175,000 doing some form of digital activity. But once people are exposed, that increases to 416,000. So you're talking kind of significant numbers in terms of radio listeners. The multiplier effect of 6 times higher comes from when, let's just look at the average advert. So let's look at across all of those 72 adverts, let's average that out. Well, if we average that out, the level of brand-based web browsing is infinitesimal. 0.7% are doing something in relation to that average advert. But once they're exposed, the level of brand-based branding rises to nearly 5 people. So for 5%, sorry. So that's 6 times higher. Again, just kind of illustrate the same point using our fictional radio station with 1 million listeners. There would be around about 7,000 who would be doing some form of brand-based browsing in relation to that average advert. But once exposed to the campaign message, that rises to 49,000 listeners. So again, it's a significant number of people. The effect is immediate. So generally, kind of the effect kind of has a build based on number of exposures. We found around 3 to 4 exposures to the campaign message within a 24-hour period seems to have the most immediate effect. So I'm just waiting for the screen to flip forward. Slight delay on that. Okay. There we go. Hang on, I'll just bounce back. So I think at the moment Adrian's got control of the mouse. So when I'm trying to move it around, it's not moving. That's great. Thanks. Okay, I've got the mouse control back now. So what we're kind of finding is that the majority of the activity that's taking place, it's happening largely on branded websites. Some evidence also of people doing broader category-based searches, and not much evidence via social media. That's probably because I think most of the creatives that we were tracking here, the call to action was very much kind of visit our website rather than find us on Facebook. In relation to radio stations, again, it's a combination of website, some social media, and also listen live. We found some evidence of variation by category. So food, finance, and some of the government campaigns had a more significant uplift. That may be because the level of existing kind of brand-based branding in food and finance is relatively low compared with perhaps more engaged categories such as real estate and events. I mean, it's kind of worth noting that some adverts also had really kind of powerful multipliers as well. So the other adverts had quite little impact, but there was significant variance in the level of the multiplier effect. So the kind of the five key takeouts are this is kind of a key piece of work because we're studying people's real online behaviour, and that provides us with very kind of strong proof of the effect of advertising within a particular media and the effect that has on people's brand-based browsing. The fact that it's kind of 6 times more likely is a very powerful message, and really kind of surprised us when we did the analysis. It clearly kind of pays to reinforce that message rapidly. That 3 to 4 times peak of that message within a short time period seems to be kind of contributes strongly to the effect that we observed. The call to action that seems to work most strongly is the call to action to go to an advertiser's website, and it seems to be where people want to go and engage with brands, at least from a direct advertising perspective. It also kind of highlights an opportunity to integrate a campaign message via the station's website. So think of integrating online and on air. And the fifth kind of key takeout is that despite the evidence, the very strong evidence that a digital call to action can have a direct effect, you still need to think about creativity, and you need to think about creating the right execution within the radio medium. Some final thoughts. So where might we go next? Like I said, I think the beauty of this is the power of observing real behaviours. I think despite the fact that it has that kind of big brotherly feel, I think it's essential when we're trying to look at how people behave online. And this is mass media. 8 out of 10 Australians listen to commercial radio, and a similar proportion are online. It would, I think, make absolute sense to kind of extend this study to TV. I think where particularly TV faces challenges around fragmentation of content, which is shifting online, with YouTube becoming one of the most important TV channels these days, and the challenges and the ways in which viewers consume digital media concurrently cross-platform. I think that's an important kind of next step because of the kind of questions that sponsors and advertisers are asking about the effectiveness of I think of all different media as an advertising platform, are asking tough questions about the return on investment from digital and social media in conjunction with mainstream media. So I think this research can start to make, or this technique tool and this kind of research can make an important contribution to answering that kind of question. Like I said earlier, we probably kind of understated how much online browsing is taking place in response to advertising that has a digital call to action, because we didn't capture mobile, we didn't capture tablet, but we believe that's an obvious next step, particularly with the high level of smartphone ownership in Australia. And the final point before I sign off is that the challenge in terms of rolling this out, it's not a technical challenge. The technology is out there. There are companies that can provide and build the cookies, etc., and apps that are needed. It's really about persuading respondents to participate in that research. I think we have a highly engaged panel. I think our panelists trust us, but kind of going the next step of saying, and we'd also like to see what you're doing on your mobile in relation to web browsing. That's another challenge. But it's more about persuading people to take part rather than a technological challenge. Okay, thank you very much.